For 600 years, one rule decided who ran the world's oceans. Whoever built the biggest ships won. Britain understood it, America perfected it, and for the last 80 years, nobody else came close. Then, in the second half of 2025, a ship slipped quietly out of a Chinese naval base and changed the math. It wasn't the biggest vessel ever built. It wasn't even the most expensive. But sitting on its deck was a piece of technology that only one other navy on Earth had ever managed to build properly, and that navy had spent 20 years and billions of dollars getting it right. China did it in a fraction of that time. This isn't really a story about a boat. It's a story about a shift in power so quiet, most people won't even notice it happened until it's already over, and by then, the rules of the ocean will have already changed underneath them. If videos like this are your thing, go ahead and hit like right now. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe so the next one lands in your feed without you having to go looking for it. Now, let's talk about the ship itself, and why a piece of metal floating off the coast of Hainan Island has admirals in Washington paying very close attention. One rule that never changed. Here's something most people never really sit down and think about. Land has borders. Air has borders, sort of. But the ocean has never really belonged to anyone. For as long as ships have existed, control of the sea has come down to one simple, brutal rule. Whoever can show up with the most force and stay there the longest gets to decide what happens next. Not on a treaty, not on a map. In practice, on the water itself. For centuries, that meant the Royal Navy. British warships didn't just win battles. They decided which countries could trade freely, which colonies could survive, and which ports stayed open to the rest of the world. An empire that never saw the sun set was, underneath all the politics, really just a very large fleet with very good logistics. When that empire finally faded, something had to fill the vacuum it left behind. That something was the United States Navy, and it filled the gap with one very specific piece of engineering: the aircraft carrier. Take a second and think about what a carrier actually is, beyond just being a big gray ship. It is a mobile airport. It is a floating city that feeds, houses, and arms thousands of people at sea for months at a time. And it is, whether anyone says it out loud or not, a diplomatic threat that never needs to fire a shot to make its point. A carrier can park itself 200 miles off a country's coastline and put fighter jets into that country's airspace within minutes, without asking permission from anyone, without needing a nearby runway, without needing a single ally in the region. No other machine humans have built does that. A submarine can hide in the dark and strike without warning. A destroyer can defend a coastline or escort a convoy. But only a carrier can project real, sustained power across an entire ocean and simply refuse to leave. After the Second World War, the United States built more of these than every other country on Earth combined. And then it went a step further. It mastered the hardest version of carrier technology to replicate: the catapult launch system. Older style carriers, and most carriers still in service around the world today, use something called a ski jump ramp, a curved section of runway at the front of the deck that flings jets into the air using nothing but the aircraft's own engine power. It works, but it's a compromise, and a fairly serious one. A ski jump launch limits exactly how heavy an aircraft can be when it takes off, which in turn limits how much fuel it can carry, how many weapons it can bring along, and ultimately how far and how hard it can fight before turning back. A catapult solves that entire problem in one move. Instead of relying on the jet's own engines to build up speed, a catapult physically grabs the aircraft and slings it off the deck at full flying speed in a couple of seconds, no matter how heavy it is. That means a fully fueled, fully armed jet can launch on every single sortie, not just the lighter ones. For most of the last 80 years, only the United States Navy had truly mastered this technology at scale, first using steam-powered catapults on its Nimitz-class carriers, and more recently pushing into something even more advanced. France managed exactly one carrier of its own with catapult technology, the nuclear-powered Charles de Gaulle. Everyone else, including China with its first two carriers, made do with the ski jump, because building a reliable catapult system from scratch is brutally difficult engineering. It was, for decades, like watching every other navy on the planet race in ordinary stock cars, while one country quietly perfected a Formula One engine and had absolutely no intention of sharing the blueprints. China wanted the real version, not a smaller one, not a cheaper imitation. The actual top-tier technology that only a small handful of engineers anywhere on the planet had ever successfully pulled off. The ship that changed the conversation. On November 5, 2025, at Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island, in front of President Xi Jinping himself, China commissioned a warship called the Fujian into active service. Named after the coastal province that sits directly across the water from Taiwan, the ship carries the hull number CV-18, and at first glance it doesn't look wildly different from any other large gray warship cutting through the water. 316 meters long. A beam stretching 76 meters across, a full load displacement estimated at somewhere between 80 and 85,000 tons, and a crew of roughly 2,500 sailors and aviators living, working, and sleeping inside its hull for months at a stretch. But here is the one detail that made naval analysts across the world sit up straight the moment it was confirmed. The Fujian is the first Chinese aircraft carrier ever built with an electromagnetic catapult launch system. Let that sit for a moment, because the gap this closes is enormous. China's first carrier, the Liaoning, was actually an unfinished Soviet-era hull, purchased second-hand and rebuilt from the ground up. Its second carrier, the Shandong, was a domestically constructed copy of that same ski jump design, an important step, but still fundamentally the older, simpler technology. The Fujian isn't playing catch-up anymore. It is the 13th aircraft carrier in the entire world to use catapult launch technology of any kind, and only the second nation on the planet, after the United States, to build one using a fully electromagnetic system instead of old-fashioned steam pistons. Picture the actual difference for a second. A steam catapult is, at its core, a very carefully controlled explosion. A sudden burst of pressure that shoves an aircraft down the deck and into the sky. It works, and it has worked for decades, but it's rough on the machinery, difficult to fine-tune for different aircraft weights, and it slowly beats up both the jets and the catapult system itself over years of use. An electromagnetic catapult throws that whole approach out and replaces it with a linear induction motor, essentially an enormously powerful magnetic rail built into the deck that accelerates the aircraft smoothly and with far more precision. Engineers can dial in the exact amount of force needed for a lightly loaded jet or a fully armed one, launch after launch, with noticeably less wear on the aircraft and far more consistency between one takeoff and the next. The United States spent roughly 2 decades and well over $10 billion developing this exact technology for its newest class of carrier, the Ford class. And even after all that time and money, the earliest versions still ran into well-publicized reliability problems that made headlines of their own. China went from essentially a standing start to a working electromagnetic launch system installed on an operational warship in a fraction of that time and at a fraction of the publicized cost. That single fact, more than the raw size of the ship or the number of planes parked on its deck, is what turned the Fujian from just another warship into a genuine geopolitical event the moment it was confirmed. Building a giant in plain sight. What makes the Fujian story even more interesting is that almost none of it happened in secret. This wasn't some hidden project unveiled all at once. It was built, tested, and shown to the world in stages, out in the open, for anyone paying attention. Construction began at Jiangnan Shipyard in Shanghai, one of the largest and busiest shipbuilding complexes on the planet, with the hull laid down sometime between 2015 and early 2016. The ship was formally launched into the water on June 17, 2022, a milestone that made international headlines the moment satellite images confirmed its catapult tracks were visible on the deck. From there, it entered what became an unusually long, unusually careful testing period, roughly 3 full years of sea trials before its eventual commissioning, a much more cautious runway than either of China's first 2 carriers required, and for good reason. Building a working ski jump carrier is one engineering challenge. Building a reliable, safe, repeatable electromagnetic catapult system one that has to launch heavy aircraft off a moving, rolling deck thousands of times without failure, is an entirely different level of difficulty. By September of 2025, the Fujian had completed at least 9 separate sea trials, each one testing a different layer of the ship: propulsion, aviation operations, weapons systems, and full combat systems integration. During that 9th trial, the carrier sailed through the Taiwan Strait and into the South China Sea, and it was on that specific voyage that its crew carried out the first confirmed catapult launches and arrested landings of 3 different aircraft types in a single testing window, a detail that told analysts the ship's air wing wasn't just a future promise, it was already being actively rehearsed. For comparison, China's previous carrier, the Shandong, took roughly 2.5 years just to go from launch to commissioning, using the far simpler, already well-understood ski jump design. The Fujian pulled off a considerably more complex engineering challenge on a similar, arguably faster overall timeline, which is exactly the kind of detail that keeps defense analysts up at night, trying to figure out how much of China's shipbuilding progress is genuine acceleration, and how much of it was quietly happening behind the scenes for years before the world ever noticed. The people behind the steel. It's easy to talk about magnets, catapults, and displacement tonnage, and forget that every single one of those numbers depends on thousands of ordinary people learning to do something almost nobody on their side of the world has ever done before. A ship is only as capable as the crew running it, and this is arguably the part of the Fujian story that gets the least attention, even though it might be the hardest problem of all to solve quickly. Operating a catapult carrier isn't like operating a ski jump carrier with a few new gadgets bolted on. It's a completely different rhythm of work. Deck crews have to learn to move aircraft, fuel, and weapons around a flight deck at a much faster tempo, because a catapult system is only valuable if the ship can actually launch aircraft quickly enough to make use of it. Pilots have to learn to trust a machine flinging them off the deck at speeds their own engines alone could never produce, something American naval aviators spent generations refining into muscle memory. Air traffic controllers below deck have to coordinate multiple aircraft types, stealth fighters, electronic warfare jets, and a large radar plane, launching and recovering in sequence, often at night, often in rough seas. China's naval academies and training commands have spent years quietly building toward exactly this moment, running simulators, land-based catapult test facilities, and smaller-scale exercises long before the Fujian ever left its dock. The fact that the ship's sea trials moved as quickly as they did, packing multiple aircraft types into a single testing window by September of 2025, strongly suggests that a large amount of that training groundwork had already been done well before anyone outside China's military ever saw it happen. Hardware can be built in a shipyard. A skilled carrier air wing takes years, sometimes an entire career, to develop properly, and that human side of the equation is exactly why so many analysts treat the Fujian's rapid progress as such a significant signal, not just about what China can build, but about what China has already quietly trained its people to do. What this ship can actually do. So what does all of this technology actually buy China, in practical, real-world terms? This is where the story stops being abstract engineering trivia and starts becoming something with real strategic weight. A catapult system doesn't just launch planes faster than a ski jump ramp. It fundamentally changes what kinds of planes a carrier can operate in the first place. On a ski jump carrier, heavier aircraft simply cannot take off safely carrying a full weapons load and a full fuel tank. The ramp doesn't generate enough speed to get them airborne safely. That single limitation quietly shapes an entire Navy's strategy from the ground up. It restricts range, it restricts payload, it restricts which aircraft even makes sense to design for carrier use in the first place. The Fujian breaks that ceiling completely. Its 3 electromagnetic catapults can launch aircraft at significantly higher weights than either of China's earlier carriers ever could. Which is exactly why, during its sea trials, the ship began testing a far wider and more capable variety of aircraft. The headline aircraft here is the J-35, China's newest carrier-based stealth fighter, frequently compared by Western analysts to the American F-35C, the United States Navy's own stealth carrier jet. Stealth fighters are extraordinarily expensive and complicated to build for one very specific reason. They're engineered to slip past enemy radar almost entirely, strike a target, and disappear again before anyone even registers they were ever there. Putting one on a carrier deck means a Navy can now threaten targets without giving away early warning, an entirely different tier of capability compared to older, non-stealth fighters that show up clearly on radar screens from a long way out. Alongside the J-35, the Fujian has also launched the J-15T, an upgraded, catapult-compatible version of China's existing carrier fighter, and the J-15DT, a specialized electronic warfare variant purpose-built to jam enemy radar and scramble communications before a strike ever begins. And then there's the aircraft that quietly matters just as much as any fighter jet on that deck, the KJ-600. This is a fixed-wing early warning aircraft, essentially a flying radar station, broadly similar in role to the American E-2 Hawkeye that's flown off U.S. carriers for decades. Until the Fujian, Chinese carriers relied entirely on helicopters for this job, and helicopters simply cannot fly as high, travel as far, or scan anywhere near as much ocean as a proper fixed-wing radar aircraft. Getting the KJ-600 airborne from a moving carrier deck means Chinese carrier strike groups can now see much farther over the horizon, tracking ships, aircraft, and incoming threats long before they get anywhere close, sometimes hundreds of kilometers out. Without a plane like that, a carrier is effectively flying half-blind. With it, the entire strike group becomes dramatically more aware of everything happening around it. Put all of those pieces together: stealth fighters that are difficult to detect, electronic warfare jets that scramble enemy sensors, and long-range radar planes watching the whole battle space, and you get something China simply did not have before the Fujian. A carrier air wing built along roughly the same architecture as the most advanced navies on the planet, proving it works at sea. Impressive specifications on a press release mean very little in naval warfare until they've been tested at sea, under real, unforgiving conditions, again and again, in front of a crew that has to trust the machinery with their lives. This is where the Fujian story becomes genuinely compelling, because the ship didn't just get commissioned and quietly disappear from public view afterward. It kept moving, kept training, and kept showing up in places people were watching closely. There's an important technical detail here that's easy to overlook in all the excitement around stealth jets and magnetic catapults. The Fujian is not nuclear-powered. It runs on conventional steam turbine propulsion, which actually makes it, by a wide margin, the largest conventionally powered warship anywhere on the planet right now. That's a genuine limitation compared to America's Nimitz and Ford-class carriers, both of which run on nuclear reactors and can operate at sea for years at a time without ever needing to refuel. A conventionally powered ship needs regular refueling and steady logistical support, which shortens exactly how long it can realistically stay deployed far from home without help arriving. So no, the Fujian is not simply a Chinese copy of an American Ford-class carrier, and treating it that way misses the point entirely. It's something more specific, and, in some ways, more revealing. It's proof that China can now build the single hardest piece of naval aviation technology on Earth, even while operating within real, acknowledged constraints. And those constraints haven't slowed the ship down much. After commissioning, in December of 2025, the Fujian sailed back through the Taiwan Strait toward Shanghai for further maintenance and preparation, continuing its buildup toward what Chinese state media has openly described as full combat capability sometime during 2026, a target that, if met, would represent an extraordinarily fast path from launch to genuine operational readiness for a first-of-its-class warship this complex. Western defense analysts, who tend to be cautious about these announcements by nature and by professional habit, have generally noted that this pace has actually outstripped what most of them expected going in. It's one thing to build a warship. It's another thing entirely to prove, trial after trial, that its most difficult system actually works the way it's supposed to, every single time, with real pilots landing real aircraft on a moving deck in open water. How the world is already reacting. A ship this significant doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the reaction to the Fujian has rippled well beyond China's own coastline. Every time the carrier has moved through the Taiwan Strait, whether heading out for sea trials or returning for maintenance, the transit has been tracked, photographed, and publicly reported by regional navies and independent observers alike. Japan's Ministry of Defense routinely publishes details of Chinese naval movements near its waters. The Philippines, locked in its own long-running disputes with China over reefs and shoals in the South China Sea, watches every new Chinese warship with obvious unease. Taiwan, sitting directly across the strait from the province the carrier is named after, treats every Fujian transit as a moment worth public comment. None of this is really about the Fujian sailing somewhere it isn't allowed to sail. These are, for the most part, recognized international waters. It's about what the ship represents every time it moves. A more capable Chinese carrier fleet means a longer reach, a faster response time, and a stronger argument at the negotiating table the next time a regional dispute flares up over contested islands, fishing rights, or freedom of navigation. Washington has responded in its own way too, not through public alarm, but through steady, ongoing assessment. The Pentagon's own annual report to Congress on Chinese military developments has tracked the Fujian's progress closely, and American naval officials have been notably candid in interviews and defense publications about just how quickly China closed a technological gap that many assumed would take considerably longer. That candor matters. Militaries don't usually admit a rival caught up faster than expected, unless the evidence has become impossible to spin any other way. There's also a quieter, longer-running story happening alongside all of this, one that rarely makes headlines but shapes the strategic picture just as much as any single carrier. For years, Chinese research vessels have been mapping the ocean floor across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and even the Arctic, building an extraordinarily detailed picture of underwater terrain, currents, and conditions in exactly the corridors where submarines need to move undetected. That kind of seabed knowledge doesn't show up in a commissioning ceremony. There's no ribbon to cut and no ship to photograph. But it matters just as much to who eventually controls a given stretch of ocean, because knowing the terrain beneath the waves is just as valuable as controlling the surface above it. Put a modernized, catapult-equipped carrier fleet on top of that kind of underwater mapping effort, and you start to see a much more complete, much more deliberate strategy taking shape, one that's been building quietly for the better part of a decade. Why this ship, and why now? Here's where the story stops being about steel, magnets, and jet engines, and starts becoming about pure strategy. Because the Fujian was never really built to fight a war entirely on its own. It was built to change what other countries assume China is capable of, quietly, one sea trial at a time. Look at a map of the region the Fujian actually operates in. The Taiwan Strait sits directly to its west. The South China Sea, one of the most contested and heavily trafficked bodies of water anywhere on the planet, lies just beyond that. Further out still sit what military planners refer to as the first and second island chains, a string of islands and waters stretching from Japan down through the Philippines that has, for decades, effectively boxed-in Chinese naval power. An American or Allied Navy could historically count on Chinese carriers simply not being able to project serious air power much beyond those chains. A ski-jump carrier with helicopter-only radar coverage and no stealth aircraft was never built for that kind of reach. The Fujian is a direct answer to that old limitation. A carrier that can launch stealth fighters, jam enemy sensors, and track threats hundreds of kilometers out isn't just a defensive asset anymore, sitting quietly near the Chinese coastline for show. It's a genuine tool for projecting power outward, performing essentially the same function American carriers have carried out for the United States since the 1940s. And the Fujian isn't happening in isolation, which is easy to forget when a single ship dominates the headlines. It's one piece of what defense analysts widely describe as the fastest sustained naval expansion by any single country since the Second World War. China has already commissioned new stealth frigates. It's currently running sea trials on new amphibious assault ships capable of launching aircraft using their own dedicated catapult systems. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's own annual assessment of Chinese military development, the People's Liberation Army Navy intends to add roughly 6 more aircraft carriers over the coming decade, working toward a total fleet of 9 carriers by 2035. A 4th carrier, known as the Type 004, is already reportedly under construction at Dalian Shipyard, and this next one is expected to be nuclear-powered, solving the Fujian's endurance limitation entirely, with an estimated displacement that could actually exceed even America's newest Ford-class carriers currently in service. There's a hard economic logic sitting underneath all of this too, and it's arguably just as important as any single ship. China currently holds the largest shipbuilding capacity on Earth, civilian and military combined, by a wide margin over every other nation, a lead built over decades of dominating commercial shipbuilding contracts for container ships, tankers, and bulk carriers, long before any of this became a military story. That commercial base matters more than people realize, because the same shipyards, the same welders, the same steel supply chains, and the same engineering talent pools that build a cargo ship can, with the right investment, pivot toward building a warship. That means China can build complex vessels, including enormously demanding ones like carriers, faster and at a lower relative cost than almost any rival nation on Earth. The United States, by contrast, has publicly struggled in recent years with shrinking shipyard capacity, an aging industrial workforce, and repeated construction delays on its own newest vessels, problems that senior American naval officials themselves have acknowledged openly in congressional testimony. In a very real sense, whichever country can build ships the fastest and keep building them without slowing down ends up writing the rules for how the next few decades of ocean power actually play out. Right now, that particular advantage increasingly sits with China, and closing it back up is not something that happens with a single new shipyard or a single new contract. It takes years of sustained industrial investment. None of this means the overall balance of power flips overnight, and it's worth being honest about that instead of exaggerating for effect. The U.S. Navy still operates 11 aircraft carriers, every single one of them nuclear-powered, backed by a global network of overseas bases, decades of combat experience, and a web of formal alliances that simply cannot be replicated in a few short years, no matter how fast a shipyard moves. But that was never really the point of building the Fujian in the first place. The point was closing a gap that used to look nearly impossible to close within a single generation. And, by almost every available measure, it did exactly that. The ocean never stops being contested. Step back for a moment from the sea trials, the specifications, and the strait crossings, and look at the bigger picture this one ship actually represents. The ocean has never truly belonged to anyone. It's the one part of this planet that can't be fenced off, paved over, or permanently occupied, which is exactly why controlling it has always meant something different from controlling land. It has always come down to presence, to who can show up, stay there for as long as it takes, and be taken seriously the entire time. For nearly a century, the answer to that question was almost never in serious doubt. Now, for the first time in a very long while, it genuinely is. Somewhere off the coast of Hainan Island right now, a ship built almost entirely with domestic Chinese engineering is running drills, launching stealth fighters off a magnetic rail that took the most powerful navy on Earth roughly 20 years to fully perfect. This isn't a finished story by any means. The Fujian still has real, acknowledged limits, and the United States still holds a commanding overall advantage in total naval power and global reach. But the gap that used to look almost unbridgeable is now being measured in years, not decades, and the next ship in this story might close it even faster. Think about how much of your own daily life quietly depends on that 70% of the planet staying open, predictable, and safe to travel across. Almost everything sitting in your home right now, your phone, your clothes, probably even the device you're watching this on, spent part of its life on a cargo ship, crossing exactly the kind of contested water this whole story is about. Freedom of navigation isn't just a phrase diplomats use in press conferences. It's the invisible plumbing underneath the entire global economy, and it only stays invisible as long as nobody seriously challenges it. That's really what a ship like the Fujian is arguing, quietly, one sea trial at a time. Not that China intends to shut down global trade or start a war tomorrow. That's not what any of this evidence actually points to. It's a much simpler, much more patient argument. It's a statement that the old assumption, the one where only a single country gets to decide what happens across the world's oceans, no longer holds the way it used to. And once that assumption stops holding, everything built on top of it, alliances, trade routes, territorial disputes, even the price of goods on a shelf, somewhere on the other side of the planet, eventually has to adjust to the new reality. The next time a headline crosses your feed about a new warship, a fresh missile test, or a new base being quietly built on some island most people couldn't point to on a map, remember this. It's rarely really about that one specific piece of hardware sitting in the water. It's about who gets to decide what happens across 70% of this planet's surface, and that decision is being actively rewritten right now. One ship, one sea trial, one commissioning ceremony at a time. If this kind of story is exactly the sort of thing that keeps you clicking, do us a favor and smash that like button. It costs nothing on your end, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because this particular story is nowhere near finished, and the next chapter of it might already be under construction at a shipyard somewhere right now. There are more videos on your screen if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole. Here's a question worth sitting with before you go. If your own country only had the resources to build a single ship, one vessel meant to make the rest of the world take it seriously, what would you build it to actually do? Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to read them.